without too much preparation, I'm going to try to give today another example of a linguistic function. What is a linguistic function? Let's start by example. So looking at this note from my application to review notes, second paragraph, space is just a property of time. That's a quote. The enemy proposition might have been time is just a property of space. That is typically reconstructing any cosmos, or better yet, formulating any philosophy. Naively, you would think, well, time is just some innocuous ticking built into the fabric of space, which is invoked singularly. It's a self-evidently existing thing, kind of like sky or earth or sea, but yet comprises all of those and is also materialist, yet owns all matter. So it also decides the policy of the motion of anything, whether a rock or you today, you in the past, and you in the future, for all time, because time is merely the possibility of these natural mechanical motions and nothing else. It does not represent fundamental change or historical change like a battle, introduction of a new technology or ideology, departure from an Old Testament to a New Testament, and like that, examples of new covenants, renegotiations of debts, settlements with the gods. And the examples flow on and on. But our purpose today is just to briefly give an example of this linguistic function, just a property of, or briefly, property of. Show you the context, or the this note from, I think, 2022, number 442. It's about an older manuscript saying this manuscript was mistaken to overvalue time against space, but it had identified events with motions. It's action, probably an independent concept of both space and time, in the sense that where it happens and when it happens may not be so important as the quality or the effect of that motion with respect to power or wealth, health, increase, decrease, and so on. And valued them, prized them above both space and time, which the note naively at the time invokes singularly, as though these are self-evident, monolithic things, the existence of which is given at the outset of any philosophy, so that space, for example, is what I call substance of existence. Not only exists, but is substance of existence in the sense that any other existent thing is only relative to that space. How so? An existent thing exists because it's in space, has a location, more actively speaking. It's the morning, so I'm just starting with a second short espresso. Hopefully giving you a pause to catch up on some of that. I have some notes here. So we just want to talk about the extraction of the linguistic function from the sentence, because this expression, property of A is a property of B, or A is just a property of B and nothing more, this kind of turn of phrase that, as you see, takes two arguments, it's going to be repeated, perhaps just as much as the terms, the sounds, words, space, and time. What to call out right here? Property of, A is just a property of. What I'm trying to decide right now, and maybe you can help me in the comments down below, is how to go about the presentation of a property of, okay, A is a property of B. Clearly, A is subordinate to B, less important, as typically effect is subordinate to cause, and accident to substance. Recall that term I introduced, substance of existence. For the physicist, for example, universe was substance of existence, and that its existence is unquestioned, whereas the existence of anything else, whether it's a thought or some objectivity, that could go in quotes, it is decided by the presence of that thing or that policy of motion or law in universe. And here's a question for another video. If this space is to be admitted as substance of existence or some major participant in all motions, is space something you're in or something you move on? Does it contain or just offer itself and facilitate your gliding and sliding, running, walking, besides metamorphosis from phase to phase of life, power, and so on? So a single example of a linguistic function. I had also said at other times, A is just a special case of B. This flavor of linguistic function, A is just a property of B. I would say that it, say you thought the opposite, that enemy proposition, for example, time, oh, that's just an innocuous ticking built into the fabric of reality, whatever that means. But the linguistic function is used to state the opposite, so it might be somewhat surprising. Alternatively, you think that space and time, insofar that these are mandatory terms in any philosophy, these are like gods that have to be placated and addressed. Oh, you thought they were two distinct things. The linguistic function does what? It fuses them. Yes, it subordinates one to the other. It puts say A and B are distinct spheres. It puts A into the sphere of B, just as the function, just a special case of like selfless behavior. It's just a special case of selfish behavior because it has some benefit, maybe deferred, maybe salvation in an afterlife, for example. Now, I've abused your patience. Is that how we say it? At the risk of abusing your patience all the more, I do want to add that this particle just, A is just a property of B. You could say A is a property of B, sure. When you add just, it of course intensifies that evaluation or revaluation. You're deciding that typically A, is much less important than B than I thought before. There's an implicit reference to a previous belief or a naive belief or their belief, some enemy. Why can't you just name the individual that you oppose? We're not in Athens, so you have to be careful. So I guess praise the individual, but criticize the category, as somebody said. Alex Hormozy again. Going back to just, it's an economic or repricing particle. And I think the note or the outline says it clearly enough. Now, linguistic functions could also, besides being these compound expressions, like just a special case of, they could also be prefixes like mono, modifies theism into monotheism, and a modifies theism into atheism. Likewise. So typically with these Greek compound words and sometimes neologisms, like neo modifies, I guess, logism or coining of a term, and so on. Now, if you want the effects of, or the benefits of, these are also linguistic functions, like the effects of, benefits of. I'm not so much sold on the trailing of in these expressions as my knowledge of Latin improves. I think it's bad linguistic intelligence. But say you want the benefits of monotheism, like the building of beautiful buildings, but you don't want the downsides. So you might institute something called pseudo monotheism. And this comes from the concept of a pseudo random number generator, because mathematically speaking, you can't really generate by some deterministic process numbers that are truly random. So you just have to generate pseudo-random numbers, which are sufficiently hard to guess for any adversary with constrained computing power. What's the point? Well, pseudo or pseudo is also a prefix linguistic function. You could even argue that S in English, like horse to horses, it makes this individual horse plural, and that's something. But S becomes problematic or insightful when you try to go from universe to universes. So at the level of an operation or idea, you're multiverting a formerly monolithic or, I don't know, monadic singular concept. Of course, you could also deny that substance of existence is sky or universe, night sky, whatever. You could say that, well, action ultimately is more important wheresoever it happened, whether in an all-containing universe, whether the universe there are many, one, just none. It's not so critical. That's what we would say. Any other, yes, and just by itself, just merely, things are merely the contents of events. So contents of, we can extract, things are merely the contents of events. That works, but also individuals, even works and makers, under this view of history, are secondary to the events themselves. You could argue that individuals only represent political ideologies which war against themselves, like two winds or wave systems. The individuals that make battle or write books are mere crests on the waves of foam. Problem with that view of history is that you have individuals like Bismarck that comprise so many different waves, both conservative and liberal, to throw those words out there. Russian noble, but also instituting social security, compromising with nationalism, and so on. So in that case, you would argue, well, no, who? This man is showing himself, in Heidegger's sense, by using these ideologies as tools to increase power, whether his power, wherever you want to interpret that. Likewise, you can say, well, the classical era of classical music, these composers, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, they're mere exponents of a wave that's always already in motion and wants to somehow express itself and just randomly chooses these individuals. It's a kind of temporal cause of individual happenings. It claims to reject causality, but it's really only rejecting mechanical causality, or the factor of, or the importance of self-interest in the writing of a music. He needs to please a patron, he needs to pay a bill, sell a symphony, and so on. We've gone really astray. I'm not convinced that I've really defined linguistic function very well. I'm going to try one more time. Linguistic functions are natural language expressions, prefixes, suffixes, and maybe even verbs that refer to distinct philosophical operations, so that you're going to have many natural language expressions, like A is just a special case of B. Write that out. A is just a special case of B. Selfless behavior is just this is a standard example. I'm not trying to be controversial. Selfless behavior is just a special case of selfishness. Might even be greater selfishness. Even be what? Greater selfishness. Oh my God. And notice the even could even be considered a linguistic function. It's a spice. It's not just salad. It's salad with salt and pepper. Or it's, not just orange juice. It's a screwdriver, a shot of vodka. Almost done with the espresso. I promise that when the short espresso is drained, we'll be done with the video. But the point is we have a many-to-one reduction of various sounds, like just a property of, and here's an example. A is merely the contents of B. A is purely downstream of B. Chemically, A is a product of B, which may be some reaction. So we're actually starting with the effect or the accident on the left-hand side and reducing to the substance or cause on the right-hand side. But the idea is that these transformations are all the same. They allude to the same fundamental idea, just as there may be hundreds of human languages, but the concept circle in geometry is the same thing, whatever the sound that is attached to it. So the same thing with mental operations, like thinking, reflection, judgment, or reduction. In this case, if you attempt to classify them more precisely, or you consider the spheres, like A is just a special case of B, so A is actually a little sphere in B. A and B are distinct planets? No. A is just a moon in orbit around B. And Martin Heidegger used to say that, like he would speak about philosophers or philosophies, that A merely moves within B. B would be a constraining, unstated premise, such as I've suggested, that where is the most important interrogative genus, so that typically any thinking, whether it claims to be philosophy or not, starts with some monolithic spatial concept of space itself, the universe. As I've said, you see this a lot in self-help, or the intent of the enrichment of individual, a new who, a new time, when, greater wealth, referring to how much. But the speaker will talk about stars, universe, asking the universe as a self-evident singular thing. But how can it not be self-evident? Well, sky, earth, sea, as were considered in Greek mythology, were distinct regions. The world had not become the monstrous devourer of his brothers, so to speak, or just distinct other spatial concepts, some concert of power. So it was like you had 7 great powers in Europe prior to World War I, and then after World War II, you have 2 superpowers, and today, perhaps 1 superpower. Again, an analogy in the sphere of global politics. Yeah, so linguistic functions, they can coin new words, they can revalue 2 distinct concepts. But if you're still using concepts like space and time, you haven't successfully introduced your 3rd concept and excluded it to actually publicly declare it to be your first idea, distinctly against prior first ideas. So what's happening here, space is just a property of time. Kant had been talking about space and time all along, besides physicists. So we're still trading the same shares for the same companies, but we're trying to enrich ourselves. Silly metaphor, but this statement is a reevaluation. And that's what I was talking about with just. And that's what I was talking about here. So property of just intensifies, it revalues or devalues first argument or sphere A. So the concept value is unsaid, but it's implicit and it's happening through the linguistic function. And you'll see that also with just a special case of we're using cause and effect or substance and accident as vehicles or I don't know, tools, scaffolding, whatever, to revalue two nonetheless foreign concepts that of which we spoke exclusively in terms of just risking what Spengler has called pseudomorphosis, that is, a distinctly new culture wants to represent itself, but is constrained by the artifacts of a ubiquitous older culture. This is what he says about the Magian culture, whence algebra, that initially this mathematic tried to show itself in terms of geometry. And he gives Diophantus, Greek or Alexandrian mathematician, as evidence of this. You can see that in his book, The Decline of the West, the reference. Now, for you, what do linguistic functions really, you could have, as a writer or thinker, you could have greater attention to your use of even, just, merely, or even, I mean, I might have pure here. Yeah, A is purely downstream. But these, obviously, these adverbs, which I guess intensify or characterize the being of, it would really be A. A is downstream of B. A subordinate to B. A flows into B. The purely modifies the linguistic function, which is a kind of action, even if it's not a distinct verb, but as it refers to an operation of subordination, then it is. Why is anybody following this? Why am I still speaking? Because I'm trying to make some point. I'm convinced that there's some critical unsaid point, as is typical in these longer monologues. And I'm preparing badly, of course, for some future conversation. Okay, but the point is that, going down here, okay, if you noticing your own use of linguistic functions. So number one, you're going to spot synonyms for the same kind of reevaluation or mental operation. For a future video, in another manuscript, I use the verb realize quite a bit, but it specifically means to show a formerly assumed premise of which you were unaware and which you regard either to be an error or something totally optional. So you could have, so it had to be, this premise just simply had to be. You needed to speak about a world or a universe, for example. You needed to introduce philosophy through some primary spatial concept rather than value or action. That's just an example, because you're moving within the primacy of interrogative category where, besides also assuming that you need to show that value or relevance by what? A dominant singular concept or individual. So you can realize synonyms. That is, as I said, you can have compound linguistic functions like merely the contents of, just a special case of, and so on. These are compound. These aren't prefixes or suffixes. I mean, realize is a natural language verb, but it's co-opted to express an observation. It's like circle. That's an English sound, but it is co-opted, hijacked to refer to that mental idea, which you can imagine clearly and distinctly. So this goes back to the philosophy of John Locke. There's nothing more. So if you reread your notes or your manuscript, you can realize hidden assumptions or premises that are not cut out. They're not carved out, cut out or carved out. They're not set to the front of the manuscript as clear and distinct or even dubious, but you have to say it as a complete sentence. Principles, laws that are going to guide your future thoughts or hypotheses in that book. So you can reduce multiple thoughts to the same thought, which might be dubious. That'll help you. And you can also realize, looking for linguistic functions, you probably train artificial intelligence to say, hey, the frequency of contents of in your writing is greater than that in an average corpus taken from the internet. You're using this English language expression, for example, just as or like, to express simile or metaphor. You're using these expressions much more frequently than their natural rate of use. Perhaps you're trying to coin some new idea or to even show to yourself an error by your wild affirmations. It's the reverse. So you could set them. But anyway, so faster discovery of useful or deleterious assumptions, premises, whatever. And this, if you don't talk with anyone, because I don't, it's dangerous. Just don't do it. Better, or for worse, you can analyze your own writing to, I guess, to cause it to evolve faster. I've mocked this notion, but why? Yeah. So go a little bit into this. Become that mind. That's a maxim in the case where you have a problem in mind. You can't solve it, but you can conceive of a mind that can unravel it. I think I've said that theologically, you can reinterpret this as becoming the mind of God or accessing somehow the mind of God. But I think in a more plain setting, whatever, that become that mind means not so much focus on the problem, especially something in the sciences like computer science or physics or whatever, if you even care that much. Just write more self-portraits, evolve faster. So perhaps by evolving, you'd also raise your level. And I guess the natural person that you are, if trained, would produce perhaps a constrained set of philosophical statements in a lifetime. So in a sense, you're really condemned to just repeat or just discover those. So yeah, maybe you can't become that mind after all, but you can become the mind that you are clearly and distinctly by reducing the 100 or so notes or thousands of notes to maybe 8 or 10, maybe even 3, whatever these magic numbers are, statements. So analysis of your own linguistic functions is useful in that regard. Linguistic functions are especially repetition. When they become motifs, Heidegger says moving within. This is in the translation of Being and Time. Nietzsche says a lot, just a special case of, and when you pick out repeated linguistic functions, that's how you cut out or shine the light on the nascent ideas in another author's work. It's just that same system of picking out the motifs, categorize them, and so on, that you would use in interpretive literature, whether Flannery O'Connor or Franz Kafka and the like. And analysis of, you're going to have fewer linguistic functions in your writing than you are going to terms. These are either currencies that are already in circulation, words in the English language, or your own neologisms, or words you co-opt for special purposes in your specialty, so to speak. For example, Latin words. I don't know, Latin words for body parts, for example, are just used ordinarily in speaking and in literature, but in the medical profession, they have specific, clear, and distinct uses independent of the modern European languages that individual medical doctors would speak. You can analyze your terms, and I think maybe the eventual goal was just to pick out your key sentences. You're going to have naive sentences like everything is nothing, all is not all, reality is not real, existence does not exist. But you're going to have to categorize these, or I guess interpret them rather, interrogatively, and also in terms of relevance. That is the value analysis that shows itself sometimes through numerical analysis, which concepts are plural, singular, hybrid, and the like. But we just wanted to show today, if you've actually made it this far, an example of a linguistic function and grappling toward the definition of what a linguistic function is, perhaps a way to represent a revaluation of values of prime keywords in any philosophy in English, for example, or to allude to a mental operation, like distinguishing the concept of reality and ideality, really subordinate to distinguishing that these two things are different. Maybe they're just different, or maybe one's worth more than the other two. So it behooves us more to know this A than this B. Will be better advised with respect to future action for greater health, empowerment, and so on. Voila.